This is Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco, 89.5 FM. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Ghannam.
And this is Jamal Dajani.
And to all of our listeners and viewers, wherever you are in the United States and throughout the world, this is Arab Talk in our new continued shelter-in-place setting in Northern California. We continue to bring you Arab Talk from our shelter-in-place, basically mobile studio in Northern California. And we've got a lot to talk about today, Jamal, but just to let our listeners know, at the time of today's show, worldwide 4.4 million cases of coronavirus. Today, we're going to approach 300,000 global deaths in the United States. As of today, so far, 1.3 million cases, and tragically, 84,000 plus deaths in the United States. And perhaps equally disturbing statistic today, Jamal, which we'll come back to later, is almost 36 million Americans have lost their jobs and are out of work. So we're starting our show today with a very grim medical reality, a very grim economic reality, and I guess we're going to start the show with another grim reality having to do with, racial profiling, the murder of African Americans, and the Ahmaud Arbery case.
That's right, Jess. Last week we dedicated a good portion of our show talking about the lynching, I would say, and murder of Ahmaud Arbery. And at the time, there was no arrest. And shortly after we've had the show, Gregory McMichael and his son were arrested. And now they have been charged with murder. And throughout the whole week, we've been getting different stories and new information, a videotape, right. Actually 2 videotapes now that have been released. And then to find out how incompetent the police department and the detectives investigating the case and the district attorney, or actually assistant district attorneys that actually changed, about 4 of them now,
right,
handling the case. It's just mind-boggling.
I'm not sure I'm not sure it's incompetence, Jamal, but we'll get to talk about that. Just to kind of trying to wrap our heads around it. And then actually now, every day there is new information. So as you know, Gregory McMichael, the father, he's a former police detective. Right.
And now we find out that actually his certification to make arrests and carry firearm was suspended in February 2019 after repeated failures to complete required training according to documents from the Brunswick Judicial Circuit District Attorney's Office. And he also including a warning in 2014 that McMichael had neglected to finish mandatory firearms and use of force courses.
Training. Right.
Yeah. Right. So every day, and then of course, we find out that this was not the first encounter with Ahmaud, that they've been almost like stalking him for the past weeks.
Right, and I don't think it's almost. I think they were stalking him. I mean, that's a good way. He had been ID'd by this father-son duo. They took it upon themselves, for whatever kind of bizarre white supremacist reason, to stalk an African-American man who was just involved in his morning jog and decided to take matters into their own hands. And as you rightly point out, Jamal, from a former law enforcement individual who lost his ability to carry firearms and basically practice because he refused to complete training. It's that part of the story is actually very bizarre. And
more bizarre is that one of the prosecutors, George Barnhill, also from the Judicial Circuit, took the unusual step while recusing himself of writing a letter. He recused himself because he knew the McMichaels, especially the father. He wrote a letter to the local police department arguing that the McMichaels' actions were lawful under Georgia's citizens' arrest and self-defense statutes because they thought Arbery was a burglary suspect when there were no burglaries
in that
on record. On record. So a lot of things happening here, just pointing to. You don't like the word incompetent. I don't know if it's a conspiracy then, if we can use.
I would say it's a racially motivated conspiracy to protect, these basically white supremacists. I don't think there's any other way to articulate it, from being held accountable under the law. For some reason, in that part of Georgia, these prosecutors, and by the way, Jamal, it was two, it was not just one. Two prosecutors recused themselves. Mm-hmm. And somehow the lack of accountability, and it was just heart-wrenching to see Ahmaud's mother just in tears because she's been waiting for accountability for months. It's hard to imagine that this was just, incompetence. It looks like it's a series of cover-ups and conspiracies to protect these two individuals from a blatant, I like the word you use, lynching and murder of this young African-American man.
Yes, and then furthermore, the Larry English, the man who owns the house under construction,
right.
Where the cameras, where he actually said that he had installed 3 motion-activated cameras to keep tabs on the property. And this past Wednesday, his attorney released a statement noting that the cameras had captured people inside the home on 4 or 5 different occasions beginning in October, though nothing was ever stolen or damaged.
Well, that's absolutely the case, Jamal, and it's important because also, finally, the Georgia Bureau of Investigations, their lead investigator, basically said anything that Ahmaud did leading to his brutal murder was in no way unlawful. So the fact that he happened to walk inside of a house that's under construction to look around, there's nothing illegal about that. No illegal or felonious activity took place. And certainly the idea that someone could be walking around in a neighborhood looking inside a house under construction and then be shot dead and murdered in cold blood, that's not acceptable under any rule of law.
Jess, I myself been on several occasions.
That's right.
I've walked around to construction sites because I was curious.
Of course.
Or I like to see what's happening. I mean, this is normal. Most people do that. It's not unusual.
Right. And if you look at that video, Jamal, that's exactly what you see. You see this young, African-American man in his running gear, coming in, looking around, and then leaving.
That's right. So anyway, these are some updates on the sad events, of course. We are pleased to see that hopefully justice is moving in the right direction, but that's not going to bring back Ahmaud to his mother.
I'm not as optimistic as you, Jamal. I'm sorry. I guess in the Arab Talk duo, you're the more optimist and I'm the more pessimist because...
Well, I don't see it any other way, Jess. This is a cold-blooded murder. This is what I see, a cold-blooded lynching. This young man was running, jogging. He was chased and hunted down like an animal. I hate to say this, but this how it looked like. The motives are very clear. He never broke into anything. He never stole anything in that neighborhood. He wasn't carrying any firearms. He was trying to defend himself when they were intercepting him, and both of them carrying guns, a shotgun meant to basically hunt wild animals with. He was gunned down in cold blood. So I don't see anything but putting these two criminals in jail, frankly.
Well, we we can only hope that justice will be served and that some accountability. But I think it's important that we remind ourselves that this is 2020 in the United States, and it's still the case that African Americans and people of color can be hunted, shot dead, and murdered. And were it not for this one citizen who happened to have the video, if he didn't make it public, Jamal, this murder and lynching would have gone unaccounted for, and this young man's death would have been we would have lost this man in vain, and his mother and family would have never had the opportunity to see their day in court. We can only hope that there will be justice served on this.
That's right. You're listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco, 89.5 FM. We are also we're broadcasting from our shelter in place. And I want to shift gears here, and then we want to go back and to discuss the most recent updates on the coronavirus. But I want to also talk about what's going on in Palestine. We also discussed this a little bit last week, and we've seen the most recent developments and the carte blanche given by the Trump administration and Secretary Pompeo to Benjamin Netanyahu to annex large swaths of the West Bank, and this plan seems in motion. Not only in motion, but it has all the full blessings, and it also coincides with the unity government that Israel is going to be forming. Although today, just an update on the unity government, Netanyahu delayed the inauguration of the unity government. It was supposed to be happening actually today, and they've delayed it until I think Sunday or early next week, because they've had infighting over cabinet posts.
Of course.
And so there is a delay, but it looks anyway that there will be a unity government established with Netanyahu serving the first 2 years of the term, followed by Gantz to complete this. And with both parties basically are in full agreement to go ahead with the annexation plan. So just we...
Hey, Jamal, before we get to our interview with our guest, I just want to make sure that we mention that we're also one day away from the 72nd anniversary of the Nakba, or the catastrophe and the theft of Palestinian land in 1948. Tomorrow's May 15th. It's the 72nd anniversary. We're commemorating 72 years of occupation, theft, ethnic cleansing, and the displacement at that time of over 800,000 Palestinians and over 580 villages and towns that were ethnically cleansed. And so the fact that we're having this discussion today and we're doing this interview and talking about the Israeli unity government is under the backdrop of a really painful realization for Palestinians on this particular day.
Yeah, absolutely, Jess. And I mean, and then the sad thing about it, this is in the midst of a global crisis.
Exactly.
The COVID-19, so which affected the entire world, that very few people are paying attention to what's happening in Palestine. With
that's the Israeli playbook, Jamal. That's exactly the Israeli playbook.
With the annexation plan, yes, and the move, and they've already technically annexed Jerusalem, and the United States has given Israel, the full sovereignty over Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. And few people complained, but that has just passed through. Although we have to say that the rest of the world is against it, but no one is making any noise over this issue.
Well, of course, Jamal, as we've noted on multiple occasions, every time there is a world crisis of any kind, whether it be epidemic, a pandemic, an economic crisis, a terrorist attack, anything. Anytime there is a world crisis and attention is turned to world stabilization in some way, the Israelis never miss an opportunity to steal more land, to ethnically cleanse more Palestinians, and to basically extend their apartheid practice. So I guess this is no surprise to you and me that in the midst of a pandemic, that a prime minister who is being, basically indicted on multiple felonies right now is on the verge, in the middle of all this, of becoming prime minister of the apartheid state. So I'm very curious to hear, what our guest has to say about this, Jamal. I just don't. We continue to try to wrap our minds around how horrible the situation is in Palestine. And you have Benjamin Netanyahu, who's been indicted on multiple felony accounts, who's on the verge of forming a unity government.
So our guest is David Michaelis. He's an Israeli veteran journalist, and we were lucky to have this interview with him. And he's actually, I've talked to him where he is now in outside Sydney, Australia. So he was also able to give us an update on the situation in Australia. Let's listen to David Michaelis. Joining us from Sydney, Australia, my colleague and Israeli journalist, David Michaelis. Welcome to Arab Talk again, David.
Marhaba to everyone who is listening. I'm calling here from Tweed Heads in Australia.
All right, so this is great. I'm assuming, I hope you and your family are doing well under these dire circumstances, and you're obviously sheltering in place in Sydney.
And near Sydney, we are sheltering, but we are doing fine because we are almost near 0 new cases in the last week. So Australia is doing very well.
Oh, this is great news. We'll talk about this later on, David. I just wanted to touch base with you. You're our expert on Israeli politics, and I think with this whole coronavirus distraction, major global distraction, no one has been talking about what's going on in Israel, and people are confused. I was watching last week, of course. A court ruling was expected by the end of the week that will dictate whether Israel breaks out of its prolonged political paralysis with Netanyahu and his former political rival, Benny Gantz, joining forces in government, or whether the country is going to plunge into another election. So what have you been hearing about this?
Well, basically, Netanyahu is the master of the game, and he succeeded to dismantle the opposition and break it apart, and succeeded to put Gantz into his government, which means that he has a large consensus government, center-right, and he does actually whatever he wants.
So he's in full control. And the other thing I was looking at, because the court, I was trying to read through the court hearing main questions, and one of the questions was whether a politician, which is Netanyahu, facing criminal corruption charges, can form a new government. That was one question. I mean, he still faces criminal charges, or whether his coalitional deal with Gantz violate the law. So do you think he's going to also beat the court in Israel?
He might beat it, but I don't think so. But in this case, all the arguments in the High Court were political, moral arguments. They weren't judicial arguments. So the court decided not to intervene and actually gave Netanyahu a free pass to go on, and decided not to make a value judgment, but judicially, they said he's on good grounds to go on till he will really be convicted, not only on trial, that he would be really convicted. So as he is still a suspect and not a convicted suspect, he can go on being prime minister.
So this can go on for years. I mean, you said earlier that he's a master in maneuvering Israeli politics. I mean, he's the longest serving prime minister ever in Israel.
Sure, he's the longest one because he is very good at manipulating all his partners on the right, except apparently for one extreme right group, which is kicking out now, the group of Bennett, and he is all the time playing to center right as far as his convictions are concerned. And he is, I'm sorry to say, he is a winner of the political game in Israel.
So where will this lead us? As you know, Netanyahu got his biggest gift ever, in my opinion, via the election of Donald Trump, the moving of the American embassy to Jerusalem, the carte blanche to annex the Golan Heights, and now another carte blanche to annex large parts of the West Bank. So, I mean, I don't see any opposition. I hear few voices objecting to this, but it seems that he's just going to get away with everything. And where is the Israeli basically political left, if any left? You know, this is not a pun on words, but doing about it. What are they doing about it?
They are demonstrating, but it doesn't help. There is a black flag demonstration group that went to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, and there were a few hundreds, but it's, as you say, nothing is left of the left, and Israel is not really an open democracy now. It's really being held by very religious and nationalist voices as the ones who dictate where Israel is going. So actually, I suggested that instead of wearing masks against the coronavirus, they should wear masks against corruption.
Wow. So hopefully some of our listeners and viewers on YouTube and Facebook Live remember that you and I, 15 years ago to this date, worked on Occupied Minds. It's actually the 15-year anniversary. And then at some point, you and I will have a premiering, another premiere of that online. Since everyone is at home, they can watch the documentary again. And at the time, David, people were asking us, can it get any worse, right? And some people said it can't get any worse. You know, Israel is building this apartheid wall, and it's a horrible time. And then here we are 15 years afterwards, and it is worse.
It reminds me at a workplace I worked at that each time we said, can it be worse? And then you knock on the floor and you feel that there's another basement that you can descend into. So since 15 years ago, the occupation is much harsher, and the Palestinian voices are totally gone from the public or space or public dialogue in Israel.
So what Netanyahu is doing now, because if you recall, one of the questions I was posing, and we were posing to some of the progressives in the Israeli side and others, whether we are heading towards a binational state, and people were surprised that we're even asking this question. But it is now what Netanyahu is creating on the ground is a binational state, but it is an apartheid state at the same time.
Yeah, he definitely, especially with his declared intentions of getting more territory to Israel under Trump's umbrella, definitely it's one state unequal, with two people living unequally between the Jordan Valley and the sea. It's one state unequal.
Well, do you think this situation is sustainable? I mean, obviously he thinks it's sustainable. Those who support him now, like about at least the 900,000 settlers in the West Bank, of course, they support this vision. But do you feel that the Israeli public at large thinks that this is a sustainable solution?
I think that they live from what they call managing the conflict. They think that it's probably from today till tomorrow sustainable. On the long term, many think it's not sustainable, but the fact is that we are now not only 15 years after the film, we are 50 years after the beginning of the occupation. So if you look at this perspective, I think that it will go on and it will sustain itself because the international voices also are really occupied with other matters.
Well, do you think that Israel has been overtaken now by the settlers, really? Because that's what I feel. Their voices are the ones that are heard, and everyone else is marginalized.
Yeah, I think it's beyond settlers. I think the right-wing nationalist voices that say that this is one country for Jews is the one voice that is being heard and is in government. And this will go on as long as Netanyahu succeeds each time to dismantle the opposition.
So let's play out a scenario that Netanyahu was in actually before this coalition, right? So supposedly he's going to serve for the next 2 years, and then Gantz will come. This is kind of like what happened with Shimon Peres, right? Is that going to change anything? Like after 2 years, will there be anything left for Gantz to change?
Difficult to say, if it will happen. A year and a half is a long time in politics, and some people say that Netanyahu never, ever kept a promise or an agreement that didn't work for him. So a year and a half is one point of departure. And the other point is that he will have some slowing down of occupation process, but really, I don't think that Gantz is a man who will change the whole balance of this one state direction. I don't believe so.
Yeah, you're probably right. I have a feeling actually that Netanyahu doesn't have even the intention to leave power, that he'll find an excuse to stay. He reminds me of Donald Trump. Like I also have this kind of vision that Donald Trump also doesn't want to leave the White House, and this is Netanyahu. Yeah. They share the same kind of thirst for control and power. I want to shift gears here. We started talking about it earlier because, I was like really glad to hear that like you guys are not that worried about the coronavirus where you live.
True, because Australia is a big, huge island. And the fact is that Australia and New Zealand succeeded to close their international borders or early enough, make immediate close down of all the population in their homes, and beat it down to actually almost eradicated all cases. And of course, there are asymptomatic cases running around, but still it's a safe haven compared to not only to the USA, but compared to Europe. It's only other countries are Taiwan and South Korea who have done similar achievement.
I mean, is it business as usual? Are people going out to the beaches and to the market without eating in restaurants? No separation in the tables?
No, not yet. It's slowly. They're cleverly opening slowly by stages because they don't want a second wave suddenly to hit the population. So they are opening schools slowly, restaurants slowly, beaches slowly, cinemas no, football, rugby, which is big time in Australia, yet only starting to do training not in front of audience. So it's a slow process.
Well, this is really great news. I mean, for Australia, and of course, I didn't know that this is how it was in Australia. I've actually known that New Zealand managed to take control of the situation very quickly and eradicate it. But it sounds like Australia is doing the same thing, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
I want to thank you, David, for your time. This is really a pleasure to speak to you, and hopefully we will be talking soon.
I hope so too, and be safe and happy.
You too.
Well, that's the voice of David Michaelis. You know, it's great to see David, Jamal. You know, because you and David have that long collaborative history on Occupied Minds, and I can't believe it's been that many years since Occupied Minds have premiered itself, and it's a good time for Occupied Minds to re-show itself. I guess the thing for me that was really surprising to hear David, and I've heard him say this before, but it's always surprising, and you kind of pointed it out, there's nothing left of the left. So you have a unity government among Israelis right now between the extreme right and why they want to call it the left, it's not, and the right. So it's the extreme right and the right. Both these, there's no left anymore. And the fact that a couple of hundred people show up in Tel Aviv to protest this craziness, this apartheid craziness, speaks to how far things have gone for Israelis, because it doesn't seem like there's any opposition to the egregious policies of the state of Israel right now. They're going full steam ahead. There isn't any room for disagreement anywhere.
No, there isn't any room. And David pointed it out, and he actually pointed it out how Benjamin Netanyahu is basically the master of exploiting opportunities, and he's going to exploit everything about what's happening now with the COVID-19, and he's not going to give up power. And then the other thing you've mentioned, I have a long history working with David Michaelis at Link TV, working on Mosaic World News from the Middle East, and working together on a documentary, Occupied Minds, which we, at that time, things were really bad, and we didn't expect it's going to get this worse. Like here we are 15 years afterwards, that things have gotten really, really worse. And one of the questions we were at the time exploring, asking about this binational situation, and for those people who don't know what's binational, this is basically having a state for two different ethnic groups, like Canada, you know, with the English and the French. That's a binational state. And then there was hope, but Netanyahu is now moving towards this binational existence, but it's an apartheid binationalism.
Right.
And during in the documentary, we discussed this with several of our subjects who had their different view and vision about this binational thing. And some, of course, on the Israeli side, they were very sensitive about using this terminology. And sure enough, now Israel is going to control pretty much most of Palestine, and with two sets of laws, one for Jewish Israelis and another one for Palestinians, which is like Jim Crow era that the United States had right here in this country.
And that's why the movie occupied minds in some ways, Jamal, was prophetic. 15 years ago, you interviewed a bunch of people, although they were hesitant to use some of those words. They completely supported, the viewpoint that you were arguing with in occupied minds. And look at where we are today. I mean, one of the things that David said that I think is really important that you got from the interview is that basically Netanyahu can do whatever he wants. He's not a prime minister. He's a king. In a way, he's in the model of Donald Trump. He doesn't care what the Supreme Court says. The Supreme Court is going to let him do whatever they want. He's going to do whatever he wants. He's going to go forward. As you said, you mentioned in the interview, he's the longest serving prime minister in the history of the state. And there's no one that's going to stop him. In fact, you have Secretary of State Pompeo in meeting with Netanyahu now in the middle of a global pandemic, in the middle of 36 million Americans, Jamal, losing their jobs, 85,000 Americans killed. And where is the Secretary of State? He's in Tel Aviv supporting Netanyahu's apartheid annexation policies. So tell me, Jamal, what's wrong with that picture right now?
Well, obviously, it's really a very terrible time for Palestinians, especially Palestinians on the ground. They're really being basically played with like a football, to tell you the truth. This is the time when everybody is holed up in their homes because of the pandemic, and there is a global crisis. The economy of many countries, including the United States and others, is tanking. They themselves suffer economically because I don't see any source of income coming their way. And then Netanyahu is just going to go ahead unless there is some new force or something would happen to stop Israel from expanding its territory. Despite the objection of the Palestinians and the entire world, this is going to happen, and it happened. We've seen it happening with East Jerusalem. We've seen it happening with the Golan Heights,
right?
And it's going to happen, and you could see even the media right here in this country trying to normalize this, shifting the word, instead of using the word occupation, into disputed territory, there is some conflict, or it's it's just a benign political game,
right?
Without holding Israel accountable to its behavior. I saw two articles just this week, one in the New York Times and one in the Washington Post, and one was about the death of an Israeli soldier who was on a raid, an unarmed Israeli soldier, and he got killed in the process. And the article was just totally sympathetic to the soldier. It's a 22-year-old soldier. He lost his life. There was nothing that this was an occupation. That was an occupation.
And he was on a mission to kill Palestinians.
And he was on a mission to basically invade a small village.
Right.
And so the way the narrative, if you looked at the article itself, the article was presenting it as he was the victim of Palestinian terror. Here you are, it's the same story. They're sitting in their village, wherever, and they get invaded by a couple of dozen Israeli military vehicles, and the people try to resist. They throw stones. One of the soldiers get killed. The Israelis that went there, the Israeli military, they're all armed to the teeth with machine guns, and then now the victim becomes the oppressor. The oppressor becomes the victim. This is how the New York Times, and then the other one in the Washington Post was about this whole idea about the annexation. It's just like a political game internal political game, the way they were describing it, an internal political game between the settler movement, the far-right Israelis and the rest of the Israelis, with no mention of the Palestinians. They are invisible. They have no say.
Right. Well,
that's how the media presents it.
That's the narrative. And, Jamal, I don't think we can leave this discussion with at least some acknowledgement of the failure of Palestinian leadership, or failure of the lack of Palestinian leadership. I mean, here we go again, so many decades after Oslo, so many missed opportunities for the Palestinian leadership to step up and to do something to, take care of Palestinians in the West Bank, in the diaspora, in the refugee camps, to really fight for the and inalienable rights that all Palestinians have, Jamal. The Palestinian leadership is in the midst of ongoing morass. I mean, still no elections, still Abu Mazen and his group are, in charge of everything right now. And it's a sad day in terms of the failures of Palestinian leadership right now. And I think, it's important that we kind of put that out there in the context of the ongoing catastrophe now 72 years on.
Yeah. So we have a few minutes. I want to go back to talking about the COVID-19,
let's do that.
But I want to make a quick comment before that about also another part of David's interview, because he happened to be in Australia. So he talked about the situation there. And I knew about the situation in New Zealand, like they hardly have any, or they were able to kind of conquer the pandemic in New Zealand, which is a small country. But he said it was also almost the same in Australia.
That's right.
And so my question is, in a way, how did they manage to do that? And when we have this, we're nowhere near that.
I have two very direct answers for you. One, people of Australia and their government believe in science, and you didn't have people, and we'll get to this in terms of the United States, who went against the recommendations of their government of social distancing. So even though the Australian Prime Minister is a Trumpian leader and, more kind of, is considered kind of the version of a right-leaning, conservative leader, he actually believed in science. He listened to his scientists. He listened to the epidemiologists. They had very strict rules in place for social distancing and sheltering in place. And most people in Australia, even though it's a big, continent and there's lots of distance in between, even in the big cities, people were complying. And in that situation, when you have a combination of a unified federal response, people believing in science and, kind of going along with the program, you could see the beneficial effects in Australia, in South Korea, in New Zealand. So there's no magic here, Jamal. If you believe in science and you listen to epidemiologists and you socially quarantine yourself and you believe in social distancing and you wash your hands and you do all the things that we're trying to tell people to do, you shelter in place, this thing can become temporarily overcome. The reason we're in the dilemma that we have here is that we actually have a president of the United States who yesterday, and this was so disturbing, and I don't know if I'm sure you saw it, openly criticized Dr. Fauci, Anthony Fauci, the leading world expert on infectious diseases, who gave a very compelling testimony in a congressional hearing, Jamal, who basically said, we're headed for trouble. If we open too soon and we don't continue with our social distancing, we're in for some horrible consequences of more infection, more death, and even more harm to our economy. And then you have the President of the United States criticize Fauci and said, he's speaking out of both sides of his mouth. And, there are other people who disagree with him. I mean, This is the kind of rhetoric, Jamal, politically motivated, unscientific rhetoric that's going to drive this economy into the ditch. We have 36 million Americans who've lost their jobs. That's an undercount. We have close to 85,000 Americans who are dead. The new projections put the number of deaths by August to be about 150,000 deaths. This thing is not under control. The heartland, the middle of the country right now, Jamal, is experiencing a resurgence of COVID infections and deaths right now. Nursing homes are out of control. Older adults in nursing homes are dying at alarming rates. And now, and this is really, for me, among the worst pieces of information, children are developing illnesses and symptoms now, Jamal, similar to toxic shock syndrome. It's called multi-system inflammatory syndrome, which means children who are getting the COVID virus are developing a massive inflammatory response in their bodies that is basically causing them to have heart attacks and for their bodies to shut down. So to go back to your question about Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, in those countries, they didn't have people with guns storm their state capitals, threatening to take down their state governments and going to the Supreme Court of their states and saying, we don't want to listen to the scientists, let us be free. This fake narrative that somehow, we have our rights to kind of go out there and be infected and infect other people. So that's the reason why we in the United States, Jamal, are in this horrific, catastrophic mess now. Even if it gets a little bit better, we're faced, and this is where this morning, I don't know if you saw it, but Dr. Bright, the whistleblower who got fired, who's the leading expert in the CDC developing vaccines, basically said, we're headed in the fall for even a more catastrophic outcome because we're not prepared. We're not going to get a vaccine in time. We've got the flu, so on and so forth. So the whistleblower was predicting a far worse scenario than even Anthony Fauci. So that's a very long answer to your question about why here is different from Australia.
Yeah, well, here is the scenario. I mean, we know that now states are opening up, right? Including counties in California. There are 3, I think, counties that are either open or will be open for business this weekend.
Right.
And then you have more than 30 states that are already open. And I was actually watching a small documentary on the 1918 influenza, and in it showed that how when it first came, the same thing, they thought it's a regular flu and they didn't have enough deaths, and then it kind of like picked up steam, and then it subsided, and then then it came back in August of that year with vengeance.
Because people relaxed.
And actually there were 3 phases of it. Before I thought it was 2 phases. So in August it came back, and it sounds like to me the same scenario. Like you open up now in May, and then August or September, the COVID-19, if it follows the same pattern, it will come back. And with the 1918 influenza, it came back with full vengeance in August, and then it came back early January of 1919. So they had 3 phases of it before. It took like until 2 years later before things kind of started to stabilize. So if we learn anything from history,
we haven't.
It sounds to me, it's kind of super crazy to kind of get impatient and try to open a month or 2 months earlier when you know the outcome is going to be devastating comes the fall.
Well, this is why when you have a leader of a country who doesn't believe in science and is putting economic short-term economic interests prevailing over the long-term health, wellness, and survival of the constituency of the entire country, and long-term health of the economy is putting the short-term interest ahead of it, why you're seeing people act in such a way, going out there saying, we want our country back, we have a right to be out there, we need to go out there, we need to shop, we need to do whatever we do, completely ignorant of history, completely ignorant of science. And we have to say that it's a failure of leadership at the federal level, yet again, Jamal. Because if you sample Americans, over 70% say they don't feel safe going back to work right now. And this is part of our discussion last week. People of color are the ones who are going back to work. People on low-income wages are the ones that have to go back to work in unsafe situations. People who are desperate, who don't have support, enough financial support to support their families, who are not getting unemployment. These are individuals who are being forced to go back into the workplace unprotected and who are going to get sick. And it's mind-boggling to me to see how this continues to happen, and there is no holding back Donald Trump and his administration. And by the way, Jamal, we said this before, it's his constituency in the middle of the country that are dying and getting infected at a much greater rate than anybody else. Yet, they continue to support him.
They continue to support him. They continue to go out carrying arms, which I just don't understand why you need to carry an M16 to go and eat a sandwich. But anyway, that's a whole...
That's another story.
That's a whole different story. And then, so what's the option? Just because it looks
Here's the option, Jamal.
The states are going to open.
Here's what's going to happen. People are going to die. And people are going to unfortunately have to learn the hard way. And I hate to say this, but I could tell you what I'm telling people is maintain social distancing, maintain everything that you've been told so far. If you feel like you have to go out, you need to be covered. Wear glasses because it looks like the virus can be transmitted through the eyes very, very easily. Don't put yourself in a situation when you're going to be in a room with a lot of people. I don't know, you probably saw this too, Jamal, but I saw there was a doctor coming back from New York on a United Airlines flight from New York to San Francisco. You saw
Crowded.
That picture.
Yeah.
And despite United Airlines saying we're going to practice social distancing, every single seat was taken and people got infected on this flight.
They were supposed to have empty seats in between passengers. The middle seats were supposed to be empty. And I was shocked to see this. And here's the funny thing that I will share with you, just because, as you know, every summer I travel. So I have reservations. And I had reservations to fly to Europe that I was working on cancellation. So I went to United Airlines. I went to first I started with the website or the app. And my reservations were a direct flight flying from San Francisco to Paris. And then I saw them, they didn't cancel it, they changed my flight. But instead of having it as a direct flight, it had 3 legs, flying from San Francisco to Houston, and from Houston to Newark, and from Newark. And I was like, why are you doing this? It looks like because their flights they're losing passengers. Right. They want to pick up passengers along the way.
Right.
To crowd the flight. And of course, I've managed to cancel it. I said, no, I don't want these changes. Paris is under lockdown. So I want to cancel it. I don't want to change it. But so United, what they're doing, because like, for example, if you want to fly to Boston from San Francisco or Washington or New York, they have reduced all their flights. They used to have like to Boston at least 15 flights a day minimum. Now they have 1 flight.
Right.
Okay. And the rest are with stopovers.
So here's my final point before we sign off today, Jamal. Your analogy to the 1918 influenza catastrophe, is a pandemic, is a good one. It could be much worse than that if we continue as a country to live in denial and deny science and go along with reopening the economy willy-nilly without taking this stuff seriously. I, for one, will never get on a plane in the foreseeable future. I'm sorry that your holiday plans got canceled, but personally, I'm relieved to hear that you're not going to get on one of these flying petri dishes. And every day I'm hearing more stories about people who get on planes, who do all the techniques, wear masks, gloves, everything, and they're still getting infected. So bottom line is, put your seatbelts on, don't get on a plane, and continue, social distancing.
Well, unfortunately, some people will have to fly because of something, work or work-related, or they need to go and visit something, their elderly
I don't know.
care. Well, definitely if you have a flight vacation or something, that's going to be all canceled, but I don't know how we are going to stop basically travel in the United States. Whether for commerce or whether for business, it's going to be very difficult. And also, I was looking at the new guidelines. And the new guidelines, this is the other thing. I mean, at the same time, we have to think about people who are going to be devastated economically. And, businesses, I looked at the new guidelines for opening some businesses like restaurants. For every 11 seats or 11 tables, restaurants can only open 4.
Right.
And they cannot have a bar operation.
Right.
And many other things. So there is no way, the Bay Area prices, rental, and so forth, that these restaurants will survive. So yes, it's going to be devastating as far as people lives is concerned, but also I predict sadly that 25% of the restaurants in the United States will shut down.
Well, on that note, Jamal, we have a sobering note, I should say. We'll continue this discussion on future episodes of Arab Talk. We want to thank our listeners for joining us in our shelter-in-place production of Arab Talk Radio. You can always listen to our shows at our website, arabtalkradio.com, where we podcast all of our shows. You can go to Jamal's Facebook page to watch our shows, Jamal Dajani 2, and follow us on Twitter, right?
That's right. So we stay safe, stay healthy, and we will speak to you next week.